It was December in the year 1750, and the snow fell as if it had been paid to, steadily, politely, and with no intention of rushing. I found myself wrapped in 3 layers of wool, standing at the edge of a sleepy colonial village in New England, where chimneys yawned white smoke, and the only thing louder than the creak of a door was the audacity of a rooster who did not understand hibernation. The village was already preparing for Christmas, or what they called Christmas in that era. A curious blend of pious prayer, unseasoned food, and mandatory sobriety. Imagine our modern holiday without the wrapping paper, electricity, or in some places joy, and you'll begin to understand colonial America in wintertime. Now, to be fair, not everyone in 1750 was going carol mad. In fact, in Puritan communities like Boston, Christmas celebrations were frowned upon, if not outright punished. To them, merriment in December smelled suspiciously like fun, and fun was alarmingly close to sin. A few towns south, however, in the less pious corners of the colonies, you might stumble upon a tavern where a fiddler scratched out a carol that started strong but ended in ale-induced improvisation. A place where folks hung up greenery not just for decoration, but as a mild rebellion against the strict voices from the pulpit. I trudged down the snow-laced path into town, with my imaginary boots crunching against the frozen cobblestone. To my left, a cooper, curled up in a woolen cap that looked like it hadn't been washed since the last king died, was hammering away at a barrel, likely destined to hold salted fish, pickled onions, or if one were lucky, disappointment. Children scampered between patches of what they probably hoped was snow, but was, in fact, more slush than scenery. They were dressed in layers of homespun fabric, which, if they were fortunate, contained enough insulation to trap at least some feeling in their fingers. Their cheeks were so red I worried they might melt the snow just by smiling at it. I slipped into the general store, where the warmth slapped my face with the gentleness of a sleepy kitten. It smelled of cinnamon, wet wool, and something that might generously be called pine. On the shelves stood wax candles shaped like stubby ghosts, and jars of molasses with handwritten labels that absolutely helped no one. Looking for a gift? The shopkeeper asked without looking up. He was stirring something in a pot beside the stove, most likely gruel or wallpaper paste. Hard to say. Just memories, I whispered dreamily, staring at a small set of tin soldiers whose arms were permanently stuck in a state of semi-agreement. Outside again, I passed the meeting house, a simple wooden building where heated debates had recently occurred over whether a 5-hour sermon was too short. It stood as the village hub, both spiritually and socially, which in colonial times meant you could argue theology and borrow a rake in the same breath. Down another lane, I paused by a farmhouse where warm candlelight trickled through window panes like sleepy golden syrup. Inside, a family had gathered around a fire, quietly knitting, mending, and roasting a goose so lean it could have qualified as a ghost. Their dog, a fuzzy beast of undetermined heritage, snored beside the hearth, its dreams surely filled with rabbits and leftover crusts. I watched the mother slide a pan of something breadish into the hearth oven. It was probably a cornmeal pudding, or maybe a bannock, essentially a cake if one were content with the idea of cake, but not cake itself. The kind of dessert that says, "I'm not here to thrill you, I'm here to stop you from dying." The snow thickened ever so politely as I drifted further up the hill behind the chapel, where the view opened across the entire wintry village. Candlelit windows twinkled like sleepy stars, and smoke curled up in soft whispers. Whispers that might be telling old quiet secrets in a language only chimneys know. A bell rang faintly in the distance. Not an alarm, but the kind of bell that wants nothing more than to remind you it still exists. And in this world, where Christmas crept in knitted socks, and the average reveller was a sentimentally skeptical farmer, peace hummed gently like a lullaby played on a slightly out-of-tune fiddle. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. The snow continued to fall, soft as flour on a warm breadboard, and I followed the quiet path toward the orchard, where something curious waited beneath the trees. The wind carried a whisper through the thicket of bare trees. Not the kind of wind that bites your nose or forces you to reconsider your life choices, but the gentle sort, like an old woman gossiping politely behind a mitten. Snow had begun to settle over the worn path ahead, a lazy scattering of powdered sugar across gingerbread earth. I had just left behind the edge of a rustic colonial hamlet, smoke curling from chimneys, children flinging clumps of silent snow at each other with the slow urgency of people who'd never seen a tick-tock. The village itself was a quaint composition of contradictions. Stone houses so sturdy they might have been built by quarrelsome beavers, standing next to wattle and daub cottages that looked like nice thoughts given walls and a roof. 1773. Christmas in the colonies was complicated, depending on where you stood, literally or ideologically. You might consider December 25th a sacred feast, a minor gathering, or the suspicious mutterings of Anglican frivolity. In Puritan pockets, particularly in New England, Christmas was a bit like dance music at a funeral. If you caught someone caroling, they'd likely be fined or, worse, glared at with such severity that they'd simply melt into the snow. Still, in the more cosmopolitan towns like Philadelphia or Williamsburg, the holiday had begun to thaw into something warmer and more familiar. Wood fires humming morning tunes, mulled cider warming from within, and someone inevitably roasting something small and vaguely game-like over a hearth big enough to house 3 goats and a political assembly. As I wandered farther down the snow-blanketed trail, the trees thinned just enough to reveal a cozy tavern tucked against the edge of the road. Taverns in colonial America were not just drinking establishments. No, they were the nucleus of news swapping, whistle wetting, and the general airing of grievances. If you wanted to know which tax was ruining whom, or whether the recent shipment of Dutch porcelain had arrived, or if Ephraim's barn had, yet again, inconveniently caught fire, the tavern was where you'd hear about it, preferably over a tankard of tepid ale and a pie filled with whichever animal had recently failed to run fast enough. I must confess, I was drawn to the place not by the promise of gossip, but by the unmistakable smell of stewed meat and the soft flicker of firelight dancing behind the hand-blown glass panes. I stepped inside and was instantly wrapped in warmth, the sort that doesn't just heat your body, but warms your soul all the way down to its socks. The room was lit with low beeswax candles and bustling with people in cloaks and coats whose linings hadn't been introduced to detergent in some time. A group of fellows sat hunched over a solitary dish of something brown and steaming. 2 widows exchanged pleasantries and judgments in the corner by the fire, and a fiddler, oh bless his wool-stuffed heart, was meandering his way through a holiday jig so slowly and solemnly that it became, quite possibly, the world's first musical lullaby march hybrid. To the side, on a makeshift stage no taller than a thick rug, a local preacher attempted something dangerously close to a sermon-themed puppet show. And lo, he cried, his woolen glove disguised as a shepherd, the angel declared unto them, Fear not, which we repeat to our livestock annually. The room chuckled politely and returned to their excellent ignoring. I ordered something suspicious called partridge stew, a dish whose chief ingredients seemed to include linen scraps, herbs, and hope. It was served with a wedge of rye bread so firm it could easily double as a roofing tile, and a mug of cinnamon punch that had evidently been quarrelling with its own spices since November. Still, there was a delicate joy in it, the way the candlelight caught in the glass, how the stew steamed upwards like a memory, and the shared silence that settled over the room when the fiddler finally picked up the pace and launched enthusiastically into a tune that could charitably be called ambitious. Leaning back, I let the heat seep into my bones. The muffled conversations blend into the crackle of the hearth, and the cold wind howl somewhere far away beyond the stone walls. Time seemed to slow, draping itself over the shoulder of the evening like a heavy cloak. And somewhere outside, in that still, whispering world of snow and sleigh tracks, I knew my winter walk would lead me next to a farmhouse just over the hill, a place where gingerbread was more than architectural theory, and stockings might be hung not by the fire, but to dry beside it. But for now, I'd sip and smile, and let the past hold me in its warm, peculiar arms. The muffled crunch of packed snow underfoot, blended with the gentle whistle of the wind threading itself through bare branches like a colonial fiddle tuning up in the woods. Dawn had yawned its first pale blush across the sky, and the air smelled faintly of chimney smoke, wool, and the kind of hopeful stillness that comes when the world is not quite awake. I walked slowly, hands tucked deep into my mittens, coarse wool that scratched slightly, but with a kind of determined comfort, like being hugged by a sheep who meant well. The path before me curved lazily toward the heart of a modest village. Nothing grand, mind you, but it carried itself with the quiet dignity of a place that had seen both revolution and rutabagas. The sign at the fork proudly read, in clumsily painted letters, New Kent Town Centre, 3 rods. For those of you measuring with anything other than 17th century peasant enthusiasm, a rod is, well, longer than a cubit and shorter than a furlong. Let's just say the walk wouldn't take long, unless you stopped every few paces to admire a squirrel in a tricorner hat, which, to be clear, I did, repeatedly. As my boots crunched along, I passed a cluster of homes, each boxy and timbered, some with moss clinging like sleepy green quilts up the sides. Smoke curled from their clapboard roofs, and windows glowed yellow with firelight. It was the sort of warm glow through glass that makes you want to befriend someone solely so they'll invite you in for porridge. Outside one house, a young boy was attempting to drag a log twice his size toward a woodshed. I nodded to him sagely, like a seasoned traveller. He narrowed his eyes and gave me a nod in return, the colonial equivalent of, "Hello, please do not speak to me. I have chores." In truth, chores were the backbone of Yule in the colonies. Christmas, as it turns out, wasn't all figgy pudding and silent nights strummed gently on harpsichords. Particularly in New England, the holiday arrived with baggage heavier than a pilgrim's conscience. The Puritans, deeply suspicious of merrymaking, had outright banned Christmas in Massachusetts in 1659. Yes, banned it. Like a poorly behaved goat at a barn dance. You could be fined 5 shillings for celebrating, a sum large enough to cause anyone to reconsider caroling or even thinking festive thoughts. Over in Virginia, however, things were a bit more relaxed. There, Christmas was, well, not quite jolly, but allowed. Families might roast a goose or exchange gifts like hand-knit socks, hand-knit gloves, or, you guessed it, a new pair of hand-knit socks. If you were lucky, the local tavern might host a mildly raucous evening with hot buttered rum and a poet who could rhyme holly with folly at least twice on command. I soon found myself passing the meeting house at the village centre, a tall, stern structure of weathered stone and dark wood. It looked as though it had once doubled as a defensive fortified pudding mould. Outside hung a bundle of greens wrapped with twine. Evergreens, mostly pine, though some overachieving family had managed to scavenge a sprig of holly for flair. Decoration was frowned upon in certain colonies, especially those run by men whose idea of a good time involved silent prayer and tactfully avoiding eye contact with twinkly things. A group of women hurried inside, their cloaks hurriedly drawn against the chill, cradling small baskets of dried fruit and hard cheese, likely offerings for a post-sermon meal, or perhaps a bribe for the parson, who had recently preached for 2 hours on the sin of overcooked parsnips. I followed the narrow track northward through the village, my breath fogging the cold morning air in gentle puffs. Around me, life stirred. A flock of chickens grumbled their way out of a coop. A man in a fur cap cheerfully cursed at his ox, who refused to acknowledge the basic principles of pulling things. A young woman carried a baby swaddled tight in quilts emblazoned with patchwork stars, and she offered a kind smile, the kind that suggested she had 4 more children at home and had earned every second of her calm. It was a quiet, hard-working world, this corner of colonial America, a place where festivities were subtle and slow-cooked. Much like the food, nothing exploded. No electric lights blinked in 12 pre-programmed patterns. But behind the plain doors of timbered homes, families gathered to share stories, salted meats, hand-me-down mittens, and, on special occasions, a pudding with enough nutmeg to stun an ox. As I followed the lane out of the village, a soft flurry began to fall. Lazy snowflakes that danced like tired feathers. The path sloped gently toward a cluster of trees, and beyond them, well, something shimmered faintly in the light. So I pulled my cloak tighter, took a deep breath, and wandered onward, toward the forest trail where the next memory waited patiently in the snow. There's something about the stillness of a December morning in colonial Boston that makes even the clatter of hooves feel poetic. As I walked along the gravelled edges of the town green, snow muffled the usual sounds, the gossiping goats, the hammering of coopers, the occasional rifle shot fired off for no practical reason, other than someone remembered they owned one. The weather had settled into that perfect New England gloom, just overcast enough to make you question the sun's long-term commitment to humankind. It was cold, certainly, but not in a way that inspired dread. More the kind of cold that nibbled politely at your fingers like a shopkeeper trying to upsell you mittens. Town was already bustling in its colonial way. Children in thick wool coats were shrieking, either in joy or because their parents had stuffed them into 3 layers too many. Adults trundled through the muddy lanes, tugging sleds filled with firewood or baskets of root vegetables, each one bundled like a walking quilt in various hues of pond sludge and flax. I paused near one of the local taverns, the kind of modest wooden structure where the ale flowed tepid and the talk was louder than it was accurate. A sign dangling overhead read, "The Cat and Pilgrim," hand-painted with a suspiciously cheerful-looking feline in a tricorn hat. I like to imagine that somewhere, perhaps behind a modest pewter tankard of cider, That very cat ran the place, keeping the books balanced and shooing away any British officers who turned up asking too many questions. Just beside the tavern was a modest gathering of folk standing around a small wooden stage, watching a man with an enthusiastic beard perform what I can only describe as colonial slam poetry, a spirited reading of "The king's taxes are hogwash, and so is his hair powder." The crowd chuckled politely, though one man in the back looked genuinely inflamed, perhaps because he sold hair powder. Yes, resistance was in the air, though tempered by a holiday spirit, and one too many cups of hot buttered rum. The Christmas season in Boston was a complicated matter. Officially, of course, the Puritans had frowned upon Christmas with such intensity, you'd think the holiday had insulted their eternal salvation. Back in the mid-1600s, Christmas celebrations were actually banned in Massachusetts, under the deeply puritanical logic that feasting, merriment, and any sign of fun were likely the work of Beelzebub in fancy trousers. But by now, the mid-18th century, things had loosened up just enough to allow for subtle festivities, a quiet wreath on a door, a hymn sung under one's breath, a roasted goose shared with neighbours without anyone posting bail afterwards. I wandered past a baker's stall where the air smelled of molasses and faint rebellion. Inside, a stout woman with forearms like ham hocks kneaded dough, as if it had insulted her grandmother. Her shelves bore a tantalizing collection of bread, each loaf with a name straight from a colonial spellbook: Boston brown bread, corn dodgers, and something called election cake, which sounded like a bribe but smelled incredible. Naturally, I bought a slice. It was dense, humid, peppered with raisins, and tasted like it had been made on a dare between two time-traveling grandmothers. You could tell it was honest-to-goodness colonial fare because every bite contained some level of moral conflict. As the snow began to fall in those slow, cinematic flakes that looked like someone shaking powdered sugar out of heaven's sieve, I continued along the narrow street. A fiddler played on a corner, tapping his boot gently as he coaxed a cozy reel from the strings. A few heavily cloaked onlookers tapped their toes respectfully. Dancing was still socially acceptable, provided no one smiled for too long or revealed an ankle. Overhead, the scent of chimney smoke drifted lazily, blanketing the rooftops in a cozy kind of fog. The houses here were mostly timber-framed, modest affairs with low ceilings and wide hearths. It was said that if you entered such a home and didn't bang your head on something, you hadn't truly experienced colonial architecture. There were candles in many windows, small beacons of warmth in the dim winter light. Some say the tradition was meant to offer a welcome to travelers, or perhaps celestial guests, should they pass this way. But I like to think it was just an early excuse to play with fire in socially acceptable ways. Evening would soon fall, and with it, the fur-scented hush of a colonial night. But for now, I pressed on, guided by the quiet crunch of snow beneath my boots, toward the next bend in the path, where, as it happened, peculiar sounds of music and a rather large wooden box on wheels awaited my curiosity. The snow had thickened by the time I meandered into the village green, blanketing the crooked colonial fence posts in white caps that made them look like powdered wigs at a particularly festive trial. Smoke swirled upward from stone chimneys in curly, sleepy tendrils, evidence that fireplaces were being nobly overused and firewood underappreciated. The town centre had a quiet charm, even in winter hush. I passed a weather-beaten tavern with a sign that looked suspiciously like it had once depicted a lion, but had now whittled itself down into something resembling a competent sheep. Either way, a noble animal for a noble place. Now, it's important to understand, colonial village greens weren't just early American aesthetic choices made to look good on throw pillows. They were practical hubs of community life. Imagine an 18th century version of your neighborhood group chat, except with less passive aggression and more livestock. The green was where townsfolk gathered for meetings, militia drills, sermons, and, in occasions of extreme boredom, the occasional competitive public reading of particularly gripping tax codes. I lingered beside a wooden bench that had likely seen better years, or at least slightly less freezing ones. A pair of boys wandered by, dragging behind them a curious sled made entirely of barrel staves and extremely misplaced confidence. Their muffled giggles faded into the distance, a sound so light it seemed to dislodge a few flakes from the eaves of the old meeting house. Ah yes, the meeting house. Every colonial town had one. In theory, it was where the town conducted its most solemn business. In practice, it was mainly a place for townsfolk to practice the fine art of passive disapproval through unusually loud coughs and exasperated parchment rustling. The building looked stern in the snow, all angular Puritan seriousness, like a man who'd spent the last 40 years deeply disappointed in lantern technology, passing a few polite notices delicately nailed to a tree, one regarding missing poultry, and one making a surprisingly poetic plea for the return of a borrowed butter churn. My eyes fell upon the community notice board. Several sheets fluttered in the breeze. Some bore elegantly scrawled sermons. Another was clearly an advertisement for a Yuletide gathering upcoming in the next fortnight. Warm cider, cool psalmody, and possibly geese. That was the colonial spirit, never less than hopeful that someone would bring a goose, or at least the idea of one. Across the square, a small shop boasted a hand-chiseled sign reading, "Mercantile sundries and tolerably fashionable goods." There, a balding gentleman in long stockings swept snow from his stoop with the same intensity one might expect from a man shooing away rival suitors. Peering inside, I glimpsed shelves of spices in faintly lopsided jars, bolts of homespun linen, a small barrel of molasses being eyed suspiciously by a cat, and rows of what could only be buttons, though their craftsmanship ranged from functional to possibly daring. Colonial buttons, let me tell you, were no small detail. They were both fasteners and declarations. Buttons said things like, "I vanquished a bear for this coat," or more often, "My great-aunt knows a cobbler." As I wandered toward the blacksmith's forge, I was greeted by the cheerful thumping of iron and a warm halo of sparks. Inside, the blacksmith was hammering away at something ambiguously necessary, perhaps a hinge, or maybe an extremely localized weather vane. His sleeves were rolled, his brow glistening with honorable sweat, and his expression one of meditative focus, as though communing with the spirits of hinges past. Outside, a basket of twisted metal odds and ends sat like forgotten puzzle pieces of a steampunk dream. Horseshoes bent in optimism, nails curled from overzealous techniques, and one curious collection of tongs that seemed better suited for grappling eels than lifting coals. And then, of course, I heard it. The gentle jingle of bells. Not sleigh bells, mind you. No, these were the soft clinks of woven harness bells attached to the necks of a neighbour's oxen, trudging melodically down the lane. Their drooping eyes and snow-dusted yokes gave them the look of monks returning from a very long vigil. Oxen have patience, dignity, and the world's best slow-motion entrances. Their driver, bundled in wool cloaks, and several conflicting ideas about fashion, tipped his hat as he passed me, then gestured upward with a gloved finger. "Snow's thickening by the hour," he said, half in warning, half in delight. And indeed, fat flakes had begun their gentle tumble once more, as if the sky were trying out a new sampler of silence. I tucked my chin into my scarf, breath warming the wool, and continued on past the lantern-lit windows and cinnamon-scented doorways, toward the quieter part of town, where candles flickered in panes like sleepy eyes blinking warm goodnights, and where, down a winding path on the edge of the village, an old Quaker farmhouse nestled beneath a grove of sugar maples awaited my footsteps. By the time I reached the outskirts of Yorktown, the snow had begun its delicate retreat, not melting exactly, just fluffing away, as though it had never truly meant to fall in the first place. A northern wind moved like gentle breath across the fields. I heard no car horns, no sneaker squeaks, no podcasts blaring from someone's backpack, just the occasional bray of a sturdy mule and the rustle of petticoats near a well. Yorktown wasn't all redcoats and sieges, you know. It had quiet days too. Days when the only thing besieging anyone was a slightly judgmental goose and an aunt asking too many questions about your love life. I wandered slowly through the side lanes, where plank fences leaned like they were sharing old gossip. Colonial homes squatted politely behind hedgerows, clinging to that New England aesthetic of everything must be beige, wood, bread, and conversation alike. It must have been close to Christmastide, judging by the telltale signs. Wreaths woven from boxwood and holly, white candles flickering politely in windows, and a strong communal agreement that wintry joy should never veer into excessive cheer. A subtle kind of festivity, the kind that looks a guest squarely in the eyes and says, "We made a small cake, that is enough." In front of one such house, a gentleman in a tricorn hat was attempting to corral a pig, wearing a crude wreath around its midsection. Some sort of festive mascot, I assumed. The pig snorted indignantly, staggering through the snow with the air of someone who had not agreed to any of this. The man tipped his hat to me with the weary diplomacy of someone 3 hours into livestock-based pageantry. "Season's greetings," he said, then added, "And if you see this pig again tomorrow, tell her I'm changing her name from Angelica to Soup." I gave him the solemn nod of one who understood both agriculture and emotional brinkmanship, then continued along the lane, past a small group of children involved in the colonial version of a snowball fight. That is, they were throwing handfuls of semi-frozen mulch and yelling things like, "God save the king," and "You're just like your father," which lent the game a strangely Shakespearean vibe. A woman paused on her stoop to shake out a rug and call out, "If you children knock over my gnome again, I'll tan your hide so fast the almanac won't have time to write it up." Feisty, for a time before, gnomes were actually widespread, but perhaps she meant something else. Or perhaps, just perhaps, gnomes truly are eternal. Further down, near the muddy riverbank, the local tavern offered its early evening light like a flickering promise of warmth, stew, and unfiltered opinions about local taxes. A hand-painted board above the door read, "The Drowsy Lantern," a name that promised gossip and goose liver pie, and maybe, if you were lucky, a game of dice beneath the table when the magistrate wasn't looking. I stepped inside without opening a door. Dream logic, you understand, and immediately breathed in the bitter comfort of burning peat and overheard argument. Inside, a man was holding forth in the corner about how mistletoe was surely a French invention, or at least involved the French somehow. His opponent, a woman stirring a pot triumphantly, countered with, "Mistletoe's sacred Henry, and if you kiss under it, your firstborn will be named after whatever herb was in your shoe at the time." This caused a round of wary glances toward each person's footwear, and a quiet calculation of which names they might be stuck with. Someone muttered, "Fennel, that ain't too bad." I took a seat near the hearth, where a sleepy dog of indeterminate breed leaned against my shin. He smelled vaguely of smoke, cloves, and something he'd definitely rolled in. A perfect festive blend. His tag read Sir Lumps. No explanation was offered. Someone passed me a tankard of warm cider, spiced and proudly opaque, likely both a beverage and a medical prescription. I sipped it slowly, feeling it settle into my ribs like a lullaby played on a harpsichord. Across the hearth, an old fiddler plucked out a tune that might have been either Greensleeves or a very confused chicken. Either way, it was delightful. And so I sat, letting the candlelight wobble gently in my vision, watching the shadows of powdered wigs shimmy across the floorboards. Colonial Yorktown, in its quiet hours, was not all gunpowder and treaties. It was warmth wedged between woolen layers, laughter fermented in barrels, and pigs who refused to be festive. Eventually, the dog adjusted with a sigh, and so did I. The cider was gone. The snow was still thinking about whether or not to fall again. And somewhere out beyond the shutters, bells, not sleigh ones, but hand-rung and slightly off-key, began to peal the hour. I rose, brushing imagined crumbs from my lap, and stepped out into the crisp evening. There was still more to see, and perhaps just up the road, a hint of something magical still glittering in the frost. The snow crunched beneath my boots in a lazy rhythm, like a soft percussion beneath the quiet hush of Virginia's frosted December. I had wandered now away from the main road, following the smoky scent of mulled cider and the curiously inviting sound of someone, yes, definitely someone, singing off-key. Colonial carols didn't always fall on the side of harmony. But then again, neither did some of the musicians. At the edge of a clearing, I came upon a modest tavern, more cottage than inn, really, its wooden shingles dusted with snow and smoke lazily drifting from a brick chimney like a yawn stretching into the sky. A crude sign dangled above the door, painted with what I think was supposed to be a bear, although he looked more like a concerned potato with claws. The sign read, "The Dancing Ursa." Not bear, mind you. Ursa. Colonial taverns had lofty aspirations and decidedly wobbly Latin. I pushed open the door, and a warm fug of firewood, onions, and faintly damp wool embraced me like a grandmother who had never fully learned personal boundaries. Inside, a handful of travellers were gathered around a hearth, sipping from wooden mugs and exchanging stories, some of which may have even contained a kernel of truth. I eavesdropped warmly from beside the fire. The tavern keeper was a round man by the name of Ephraim, who moved with the briskness of someone who survived off both business and rumour. He greeted me with a nod and offered me a cup of hot wassail that tasted like apples, nutmeg, and a whispered lecture in 17th century temperance. Over in the corner, two fiddlers were engaged in a tender battle of who could play more notes per second. It wasn't music so much as a woodsy declaration of speed. I asked Ephraim about it, and he told me, with the gravitas of someone who's seen things, "Oh, they've been at it since Wednesday. Neither of them can win, since neither of them can stop." While I sipped, I watched a game of draughts unfold on the table nearby. Checkers, to the modern who don't keenly follow pre-revolutionary board game nomenclature. One player wore a cocked hat so extreme It threatened to knock over the candle every time he looked left. His opponent, a stoic-looking woman named Maud, was winning so handily she'd begun playing with her eyes closed. Colonial taverns, it turns out, were more than places to drink. They were forums of politics, hubs for gossip, and unofficial post offices, all while managing to be just drafty enough to encourage stories over stalling. You could hear, in one evening, an impassioned ode to liberty, a conspiracy involving pigs, and at least one dramatic reenactment of someone being startled by a squirrel. Whether these things were connected, no one cared to ask. As the evening settled in and candles turned their waxy faces downward, Ephraim pulled a bundle from beneath the bar. Mail, or something like mail. Letters from Kent. An invitation from the next farm over to help raise a barn wall. A half-frozen notice from Williamsburg offering a reward for the return of a politician's stolen wig. Hair theft was rampant in colonial December. All that dry air. He laid the bundle out by the fire, letting the papers thaw as peasants once did their knees. I was reminded that the colonial postal system involved no postboxes, no uniformed couriers. It relied instead on tavern patrons volunteering to carry messages to neighbouring towns. A system which prized literacy, trust, and large pockets. One man stood and pinned a scrap of parchment to the wall, what appeared to be a recipe for gingerbread, titled simply, "For Stomach and Spirit with Joy." That's how traditions formed in those days. Someone slurred something helpful in public, and someone else wrote it down. Eventually, the fiddlers tied themselves into a drawer, collapsing back into their stools, while muttering unintelligibly about their fifth cousin's fiddlebow inheritance. The fire dipped lower, flames licking the logs as if trying to lull them to sleep too. Outside, flakes whispered down, each one a tiny historical footnote from the sky. And so, after thanking Ephraim and declining a second mug of cider for fear of dreaming in Old English, I stepped back outside into the snow-covered hush. Lights flickered down the path, guiding me onward toward the night's next wonder, a bustling winter market tucked among the colonial stalls where pine and spice chased each other on the wind. As I wandered further along the snow-dappled path, a sleepy hush had settled over the colonial hamlet, broken only by the occasional creak of wagon wheels and the lazy clucking of a chicken, who, I can only assume, had utterly forgotten where it lived. The December air was tinted with wood smoke and subtle cinnamon, like a gingerbread candle left too close to the hearth. And before me, a modest tavern came into view, wide-beamed, low-roofed, and proudly lopsided, as if one side had momentarily dozed off. By its weathered sign, the cheerful depiction of a hog dancing precariously atop a barrel, I deduced this was Ye Merry Swine, the local inn of choice for travellers, misfits, and moderately successful pie smugglers. Inside, warmth wrapped around me like a well-worn quilt, the kind your great aunt insists on giving you despite it smelling faintly of 1742 and mothballs. Rough-hewn beams stretched across the ceiling, occasionally smacking the hats off the taller patrons. A roaring fire blazed in the stone hearth, and benches were packed with thick coats, woolen stockings, and the ever-present colonial frown that passed for casual friendliness. An innkeeper with a nose like a very wise potato looked up from polishing a pewter mug. "A suppin?" he asked plainly, which I took to mean, "Would you care to dine, stranger?" Or perhaps, "Are you edible?" Context was key in colonial vernacular. I nodded graciously and was soon presented with a wooden plate containing a wedge of salt pork, a scoop of mushy peas, and a biscuit so sturdy it could have successfully defended Fort Ticonderoga. delicious in that charming way food becomes once you're cold, tired, and willing to believe in miracles. As I nibbled cautiously, the tavern filled with lazy conversation, bursts of laughter, and the sweet creak of old stories being lifted off the shelf for a retelling. A small group of red-nosed gentlemen sat near the fire debating whether General Washington's teeth were truly made of wood or merely the same material as their dining tables, which was to say, quite possibly both. Walrus ivory, one man insisted, nodding gravely, the very same used in Parliament. Whether or not this was true mattered very little. The conviction in his voice gave it the weight of Holy Writ. Across the room, a fiddler warmed up, tentatively at first, like a cat testing frozen pond water with one paw, then with full gusto, breaking into a jig so lively it might well have offended a Puritan. A few couples attempted something resembling dance. Mostly, it involved clapping, turning, and trying not to twist an ankle on the uneven plank floor. I slipped into a bench near an old-timer wrapped in layers of plaid and smelling faintly of cider and experience. He gestured at my cup. "Made from last year's apples," he said proudly. "Had to fight off raccoons for 'em." "Ah," I replied. "What vintage?" He leaned closer. "Merry Swine makes the best wassail in the colony. Strong enough to knock the king off his horse, and warm enough to persuade your frostbitten toes to stay another night." Wassail, of course, was the colonial version of a mulled cider, infused with spices, apples, and enough spirit to convince you that singing at strangers' doors in freezing temperatures was a solid plan. And yes, readers of modern sensibilities might raise an eyebrow at the hygiene standards and open fire codes of taverns like this, but there was something enchantingly human about it all. The cheerful sense that even in a world without central heating or dental plans, people made room for fiddle songs, laughter, and the intoxicating promise of shared warmth. One could imagine the local blacksmith sitting the same place I did, boots off and feet steaming gently in socks knit by someone special. A travelling cloth merchant, fatigued from endless potholed roads, might have slurped that same stew and tipped the same barkeep with a coin and a lazy wink. There was, in that tavern, a kind of timelessness, a sleepy continuity of humans marking December's chill, not with despair, but with good food, strong drink, and slightly off-key caroling. Outside, the snow had picked up its pace, swirling like it had secrets to keep. I drained the last of my wassail, thanked the wise potato innkeeper, and stepped back into the night. Snowflakes kissed my coat. The stars blinked above like they, too, had paused to warm their feet by the fire. And somewhere ahead, further down this sleepy colonial lane, the soft clang of a blacksmith's forge was calling out like a heartbeat from another time. A fresh dusting of snow whispered beneath my worn leather soles as I wandered into a quieter neighborhood of the colonial village, a place where the smoke curled more lazily from chimneys and the pace of life, though never exactly frantic, had shifted perceptibly into the realm of gentle puttering. The houses here were smaller, less ostentatious than the governor's mansion, but they exuded a warmth from within that the larger estates somehow lacked. Their windows glowed with candlelight and, more importantly, the unmistakable silhouettes of someone inside holding a mug. I paused at one such dwelling. Shutters painted the colour of faded cranberries, a wreath made of woven boxwood adorning the door. The scent of molasses and wood smoke mingled in the air like humble cologne on an apron-wearing ghost. Before I could knock, or perhaps faint politely on the doorstep, the door creaked open to reveal a woman in a ruffled cap and a sense of purpose. She peered at me, decided I wasn't a redcoat or a tax collector. It was the eyes that gave me away, too sleepy for either, and ushered me inside with the maternal urgency of someone who had spent all morning boiling cider and was impatient to serve it. Inside, the home was candlelit and fragrant, the kind of aroma that says, yes, you've walked into a gingerbread-scented time machine. And yes, cookies are involved. There on the hearth, a tin reflector oven spun slowly before the fire, cradling a roast that smelled like it held historic secrets of its own. This was the home of the Paynes, an industrious couple known in the village for their excellent pies and slightly paranoid habit of hiding their spoons before guests arrived. Mr. Payne, a bespectacled postmaster with eyebrows as vast as New Hampshire, greeted me with the formality of someone who hadn't had a visitor in a week and had spent most of it drafting conversation topics for just such an occasion. "Good eve," he intoned. "Might I interest you in a syllabub?" Now, if you've never encountered a syllabub, imagine what would happen if whipped cream, wine and lemon zest got a little tipsy and started singing madrigals together. It was a popular holiday treat in colonial America, and judging by the glass he served me in, a sort of heroic goblet with the girth of a small bird bath, it was a beverage best sipped slowly, with emergency biscuits on standby. As I sipped, Mrs. Payne animatedly recited her mincemeat recipe from memory, punctuating each step with mysterious euphemisms like "boil it till it repents" and "stir it 3 times for luck" or "rum," whichever is closer. Mincemeat, I learned, did in fact contain meat, historically speaking, and was less a dessert and more an edible almanac of what needed using up before spring. It was everything a sensible colonial Christmas needed, practicality disguised as festivity. The Paynes, like many colonial families, made do with humble touches during the holidays. There were no sleighs brimming with gifts, no tinsel beyond what nature dropped from the stove vents, but there was storytelling, that glorious, slow-motion art of orally passing down wisdom, with liberal amounts of embellishment and accidental rhyming. Mr. Payne launched into a tale about the Christmas 3 years prior when a wild turkey strutted brazenly into church service and was voted unanimously less distracting than the preacher. I sat there, slowly absorbing the warmth from the fire and the syllabub, and thought about how colonial Christmas lacked grand spectacle, but brimmed with sincerity. No bustling department stores, no frantic gift tallying, just the comfort of company, a shared pie, and the occasional carol hollered with joyful tunelessness by someone who'd had one too many plum puddings. The fire crackled low like a sleepy percussionist, and outside, snowflakes tiptoed down in a quiet chorus. Mrs. Payne doled out a final shortbread round with the solemn authority of a pastry pope, then bid me stay as long as I liked, or at least until the Yule log burned out. But I felt the wind calling me onwards again, and so I thanked them with the gravity of someone departing a feasting hall and stepped back into the gentle dark, my coat a little warmer, my heart a good deal fuller, and my breath permanently spiced. The village was quieter now, hush wrapped around every chimney. Somewhere beyond the next grove of trees, flickering lantern light beckoned me onward, to a barnyard nativity carried out by particularly unwilling livestock and one overly enthusiastic reverend. The snow crunched beneath my boots like a loaf of stale bread being stepped on very politely. Frost clung to the bare branches above me, and the sky wore its best December grey. As I continued my wintry walk through colonial America, I began to hear the sound of merriment drifting through the trees, laughter, bells, and the unmistakable clatter of something wooden being joyfully misused. I followed the sounds, only slightly unnerved that I was essentially tracking down colonial joy like a suspicious squirrel. Through a clearing I saw it, a village green bustling with Yuletide cheer, and right in the middle, several grown men in waistcoats and wool stockings were attempting to slide across a frozen pond on wooden planks fastened to their feet. Ice skates, if you're generous. A vertical death wish for ankles, if you're honest. One of them wobbled past, arms pinwheeling. He barely avoided a collision with a barrel that had been inelegantly repurposed as both a firewood holder and a small ramp, for reasons unknown, but clearly enthusiastic. "Welcome to the winter frolic," announced a woman in a deep green cloak as she approached me, cheeks rosy and smile wide. "Don't mind the screaming. That means they're having fun." She nodded toward the pond. Her name was Ruth, and she informed me that every December, the townsfolk held the frolic to celebrate the blessings of the past year, surviving smallpox for one, and making it through another colonial committee meeting without throwing a shoe at someone. Apparently, such administrative meetings were particularly heated around tax season and hog census time. Ruth offered me a mug of cider so hot it glowed like it had an internal monologue. It smelled of apples, cloves, and the kind of cinnamon that threatened to make your nose wish it had nostril mittens. I drank it carefully, instantly warmed from the inside out, as if someone had wrapped my lungs in wool. The festivities continued with a sack race in the snow, a concept equal parts delightful and deeply unwise. Colonial children squealed with laughter as they hopped madly across the lawn, often falling over in synchronized duets of joyful collapse. One small boy shouted, "No King George can catch me," as he tumbled gloriously face first into a drift. Historic accuracy was debatable, but the enthusiasm was impeccable. Nearby, a group of elders were constructing ornaments out of scraps of tin, dried orange slices, and dangerously ambitious amounts of ribbon. One man, who introduced himself in full as Mr. Thaddeus P. Winklebottom III, was weaving a garland made entirely from shaved whalebone curls and goose feathers. It was likely not flammable. It was definitely flammable. Food tables groaned under the weight of roasted nuts, honey cakes, and something called spider bread, which, thankfully, contained no visible arachnids. I was assured the name simply came from the cast iron skillet, a spider, in which it was baked. Still, I gave it a suspicious nibble, just in case Colonial America had invented edible practical jokes. Ruth led me to a bonfire surrounded by handmade benches, where the linen and laced sat with the wool and calloused, passing around stories and smoky sausages on sticks. The tales were, as was tradition, 40% truth, 30% imagination, and 30% spirited exaggeration. One elder claimed he'd once seen Benjamin Franklin ride a turkey through a snowstorm to deliver mail. Another resident nodded respectfully, suggesting it was probably true, given Franklin's unusual hobbies. As snow began to fall again, soft as candle wax drips, a group of fiddlers struck up a tune so delicate and sweet it felt like a lullaby embedded in pine wood. Couples twirled slowly across the snow-packed ground, leaving swirls of footprints and giggles in their wake. I watched a young girl offering a clove-studded orange to an elderly neighbor, who responded with a smile wide enough to defrost an ink bottle. The winter frolic wasn't perfect. One could end a sentence with, "and then the goat chewed through the decorations," more often than statistically probable, but it was beautiful. A glimpse into the colonial heart, warmed by cider, soothed by music, always slightly damp from melting snow. As the bonfire popped, and one of Thaddeus P. Winklebottom III's garlands caught a small, festive flame. I eased further back on the bench, eyelids heavy, heart full. Through the falling snow, I spotted a flickering lantern leading down a narrow, pine-lined lane. Hushed, voices trailed just ahead, and the smell of gingerbread wafted in the wind. I rose and followed, the next wintry wonder waiting just around the bend. The snow had stopped falling sometime between my second bowl of cornmeal mush and the local tavern's reenactment of the Boston Tea Party using teacups, cats, and highly enthusiastic children. No actual tea was harmed, of course, too precious, and the cats only mildly inconvenienced. One had claimed a tri-cornered hat and absolutely would not give it back. With the storm settled and the sun shyly peeking through the silvery sky, I wandered outside once more, into a colonial main street dusted with snow and dotted with the slow-moving bustle of December chores. Horses moved like sleepy ghosts through the slush, and somewhere nearby, a fiddler practiced a tune that almost, but not quite, sounded like early prototypes of Jingle Bells, which, oddly enough, wouldn't actually be associated with Christmas for quite a while. Originally titled One Horse Open Sleigh, it was composed in the 1850s by James Lord Pierpont and was meant as a Thanksgiving tune. But let's not let a little anachronism ruin our snowy stroll. This particular corner of colonial America seemed happy to let time blur for the sake of charm. I passed a carpenter's shop where the scent of pine boards and beeswax mingled in the air, painting the nostrils with quiet dreams of Yule logs and garlands. Inside, a man with a beard much larger than his apron meticulously carved what appeared to be a wooden fox, though it also might have been a church pew. Hard to say. The style of the time left much room for interpretation. Next door, a milliner's window displayed a modest but cozy offering of felt bonnets, woolen mitts, and a single sprig of holly bravely poked into a mannequin's cap. The mannequin, incidentally, looked rather judgmental. Not unusual for the era. Expressive restraint was all the rage, and mannequins followed suit. Colonial Christmas, as I was learning, was a subtle affair when compared to our present-day tinsel extravaganzas. In New England especially, many Puritan communities were quite suspicious of anything that smacked of merriment. They'd actually banned Christmas altogether for a time, citing its papist origins and general risk of joy. But down here, in a small, slightly more tolerant town near the borderlands of good sense and holiday cheer, there was a quiet blooming of the season. A few families hung pine boughs by the door, ducking under them bashfully, as if engaging in mild illegal activity. Several homes had candles glowing in their windows, not for Santa Claus, who, in his colonial prototype, was still splitting duties with St. Nicholas, Father Christmas, and an unfortunate character called Bellsnickel, who looked like he'd been evicted from a Dickensian alley, but simply to light the way for visitors, or hopeful spirits, or both. As I strolled past one such flickering window, a family inside laughed over a bowl of syllabub, one of the more dramatically named colonial treats, which involved cream, sugar, a dash of lemon, and a suggestive amount of sherry. It looked vaguely like whipped cloud seasoning, and it made my stomach rumble in a low, diplomatic tone. A little further on, I met an elderly shopkeep who sold imported fabrics and secrets. He let me in on a delicious whisper from Williamsburg. A wealthy family had just received an entire orange in a Christmas parcel. One, whole, orange, from the Caribbean, no less, and kept safe in a waxed paper wrap as if it were a precious jewel. Word had it the children simply stared at it for 10 minutes straight, before anyone dared lift it from the box. Citrus, it turns out, was the 18th century equivalent of a brand new gaming console. Rare, expensive, joyful, and destined to be squabbled over during dinner. The orange, naturally, became the table's centerpiece. Just before dusk, I found myself at the edge of the green, where a pair of apprentices attempted to build a snowman using what I suspect was a turnip for a nose and some buttons pilfered from their master's shirt drawer. Their creation leaned heavily to one side, as if attempting to bow to the oncoming twilight. A bell rang in the meeting house, not for any particular reason other than it was 5 o'clock, and colonial schedules loved a good clang. And so I lingered, beneath chimney smoke curling skyward like sleepy thoughts, watching as lanterns were lit one by one. The wind had softened, the snow stiffened a little underfoot, and the quiet hum of preparation, perhaps not for Christmas exactly, but for something like warmth or togetherness, settled into the bones of the village. I took a deep breath, smelled wood smoke, snow, and the unmistakable note of impending pudding, and then I turned, wool-caped and wondering, toward the workshop on the hill, where rumours of hand-carved gifts and curious inventions warmed the imaginations of those who still believed that winter had magic in it. The snow had started to fall again, in that quiet, thoughtful way that feels less like weather and more like a suggestion from the sky. I had wandered just past the smithy, where the air still hummed faintly with iron and ember, and found myself near a modest brick structure strung with dried orange peels hung in tiny garlands, Colonial America's idea of Christmas decorations. Tangerines weren't just exotic, they were theatre. A portly gentleman, eyes twinkling and cheeks coloured like boiled beets, waved me in with a mittened hand. "Come in from the cold," he said. "You look like you've wrestled a snowdrift and lost." This was the local tavern keeper, Mr. Tobias Wren, a man with the body of a cider barrel and a disposition to match, warm, spiced, and likely to make one drowsy. Inside, the tavern glowed with candlelight and clove-scented mirth. A wooden sign above the hearth read, "Ye Merry Cod," which, on further inquiry, I learned was not a fish-related joke, but rather a pun lost to time and regional dialect. The truth, Tobias whispered with the glee of a schoolboy telling ghost stories, was that the sign had once said, "Ye Merry God," but someone had spilled ale on it in 1749, and the paint had never quite recovered. The congregation protested, but the tavern goers rather liked the fish idea better, and so the cod remained, merry as ever. The hearth crackled as a lute player strummed slow, sleepy tunes that sounded remarkably like Christmas carols, given a colonial twist. "God Rest Ye Merry, Gentlefolk" had a slower tempo and fewer consonants, but the heart remained. At a table near the fire sat a group of older folks engaged in what may have been a very slow-moving card game or a profoundly dramatic staring contest. Colonial diversions were earnest and often ponderous, like playing charades underwater. Here, over a cup of warm shrub, a once trendy vinegar-based cocktail that sounds like something you'd trim with garden shears, I learned a bit about Christmas customs in the colonies. You see, holiday cheer in the 18th century was shaped by which part of the colonies you called home. In Boston, the Puritans still subtly glared at anyone who dared whistle anything even remotely jolly. In Virginia, however, Christmas was a social occasion that bordered on theatrical. Feasts, dances, and something called the Mask of Misrule, which sounded delightfully chaotic and deeply full of raisins. Colonial Christmas food was not for the faint of palate. Plum pudding, which by name alone sounds like something that might jiggle with foreboding, made annual appearances. It contained no plums, but plenty of sweat, spices, and the aforementioned raisins, because nothing said celebration like dried fruit united in glistening union. Tobias offered me a ginger cake the size of a paving stone and roughly the same density. Apparently, it was a delicacy, sweetened with molasses, spiked with ginger, and aged slightly less than most furniture. I took a bite and was immediately transported into a flurry of ginger, wood, and existential reflection. Pairs well with brandy, Tobias winked, or small chisels. As the evening waned, guests nestled into corners of the tavern, heads bowed not in prayer, but in the early stages of sleep. The colonial lullaby wasn't sung. It was sipped slowly over hours and woven into the flickering rhythm of firelight and fiddle. Through the frosted window, I could see the snow thickening like a quilt, tucking the town in beneath its polite hush. Somewhere outside, carolers passed by, admittedly off-key, but with such enthusiasm that it bordered on bravery. I bade my thanks to Tobias Wren, who handed me a small paper-wrapped parcel for the journey, he said. Inside was a tiny pomander, an orange stuffed with cloves and tied with a ribbon. Keeps moths away, he said cheerfully, and, in some cases, unwanted suitors. I stepped outside, back into the snow, the gentle scent of citrus and spice following me like a protective spell. Somewhere farther down the cobbled street, a lantern bobbed ahead, and the silhouette of another dwelling waited, wrapped in garlands and mystery. Perhaps a colonial printing press, or if I were especially lucky, a Christmas tree before Christmas trees truly became a thing. I pulled my cloak tighter and wandered on, the dream deepening with each careful, crunching step. The snow had picked up again, dusting the rooftops of the sleepy village with the careful touch of a baker sifting flour across morning bread. I stepped out from the candlemaker's shop and watched the flakes spiral down like tiny frozen quill feathers seeking a parchment earth. Everything, and I do mean everything, glistened with that magical colonial silence, the kind that settles in when there's no traffic, no screens, and nothing louder than a fiddle played indoors. I wandered east, past a row of half-timbered houses, and toward the square where, it was whispered, a curious tradition was underway. A small procession had gathered outside the meeting house, their cheeks pink from both the cold and a hearty helping of fermented cider. They wore a mix of wool cloaks, linsey-woolsey shawls, and that ever-popular accessory of the 1770s, enthusiastic practicality. At the centre of the gathering stood a man in a rather dramatic wig, one which appeared to be more squirrel than style, and he was holding aloft what I feared might be a large loaf of bread. "It's the Yule loaf," he declared, which, to my delight, was not just a nickname for his midsection. In some parts of colonial America, especially where Old English and German customs lingered like mistletoe in the rafter beams, the Yule loaf was baked as a symbol of good luck, and perhaps also as a convenient winter weapon. This particular loaf looked more like a well-fed boot than a baked good, but as he broke it open, steam rose like incense from its center. Children clapped, a dog barked, a distant goose showed zero interest. I was handed a steaming piece of the hearty bread and invited to join in a game called Snap Apple, which turned out to be less romantic than it sounded. 2 apples dangled from strings above the heads of willing participants, and the idea was to bite one without using your hands. I watched as 2 gentlemen in remarkably similar breeches lunged toward the fruit like colonial swordfish, their powdered wigs swinging like overconfident wind chimes. There was laughter, applause, and a banana peel-style tumble when someone failed to account for the slight slipperiness of snow-covered cobblestones. It was the kind of merriment you'd expect from a people who had endured long seasons of wood chopping, privy emptying, and oatmeal made of mostly oats and exclusively mealtime. As the apple declarations quieted down, a young girl approached, carrying a small lantern. "Would you like to see the kissing ball?" she asked, her voice shy but hopeful, as though she were offering a glimpse of a mythical beast or a rare coin minted before breakfast. She guided me to a nearby doorway where above the lintel hung what at first looked like a mossy tumbleweed. Upon closer examination, it was something far more charming. A Christmas kissing ball made of evergreen branches, dried berries, and, you guessed it, mistletoe. Before mistletoe was reduced to a flimsy plastic sprig in supermarket impulse aisles, colonists crafted these full, round bundles to hang in doorways as a festive welcome, and possibly as a sneeze trap for the allergic among them. It was customary to kiss under the ball, of course, though the rules seemed refreshingly unspecified. Someone kissed a neighbor's hand. Another kissed her dog. One very enthusiastic young man kissed the entire ball, earning a polite and deeply colonial cough from someone nearby. Modesty, my dear listener, was the most universally enforced currency of the time, especially when it came to greenery-based smooching rituals. I found myself suddenly wrapped in the warm steam of mulled cider once more, carried by someone in a red wool cloak that, I must say, would have made Santa himself cast a jealous glance. The cider was infused with cinnamon, clove, and orange peel, ingredients they'd traded dearly for, packets of pungent dreams shipped across the Atlantic in tiny barrels and big hopes. Drinking it was like sipping the hearth itself. The village square dimmed just slightly as the lanterns danced to life, and the ancient Yule songs began again, drifting through the air like lullabies sung by history herself. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the creaking of a wooden sled, drawn by a donkey with more attitude than speed. Children rushed to help unload bags of what looked like, yes, wooden toys, handcrafted by some exceptionally patient and underpaid father over the course of the year. As I tucked my scarf tighter and drifted toward the edge of the square, I couldn't help but marvel at the subtle art of celebration here. Nothing quite matched, nothing glittered, and yet everything glowed. The road continued, winding like a sleepy ribbon between snowbanks, and I followed it, soft boots crunching gently toward a sight I had heard whispers of, but had yet to believe. Something involving leaf spring carriages, joyful mayhem, and a colonial tavern's idea of holiday karaoke. The snow had thinned to a quiet flurry, as if the sky were brushing dandruff from a powdered wig. I meandered down a wide path pressed firm with the prints of many colonial boots, square-toed, buckle-flaunting boots, mind you, leading toward the center of a surprisingly festive hamlet, Williamsburg, Virginia, the year somewhere snug between tavern gossip and someone just called Ben Franklin a rascal. Here, winter did not so much storm as it politely suggested its presence. A dusting of snow rested on rooftops like powdered sugar on a very confused gingerbread house, and smoke curled from chimneys like warm sighs from a crowd of tired history teachers. There was a stillness here, a slow rhythm to life, like everyone had collectively agreed to take one large deep breath and just stew in molasses until spring. As I approached the town square, I noticed candles in the windows, every window. It was a sign not only of the season, but of hospitality, remembrance, and possibly fire insurance premiums needing a boost. These single candles, usually nestled in metal holders or hooks, glowed warmly. They weren't electric, obviously. Thomas Edison wouldn't even begin his life of brilliant sneezes for another 100 years. No, these were real waxy flames, fluttering like delicate little ghosts trained in interpretive dance. A courtesy to travelers, they told me. A sign that one was welcome. That, or an 18th century way of saying, we definitely don't have a doorbell. Christmas time in colonial Virginia was a softer affair than you might imagine. No jingle bells, no red-suited intruders tumbling down improperly swept chimneys. The celebration leaned Anglican, quiet church services, hymns sung by candlelight, and a steady consumption of meats, puddings, and aggressively mulled wines. The colonists may not have decorated evergreen trees indoors, yet, but they knew full well how to hang greenery from doorways with the same seriousness they reserved for tax discussions and gossip about who had the nicest waistcoat. Greenery, in fact, was everywhere. Holly, ivy, pine boughs tied with ribbon, and mistletoe dangling like a passive-aggressive trap over the entrance to more than one parlour. It wasn't just decoration. It was tradition drawn from Old English customs, and a way to say, yes, we're technically struggling with debts from the imported tea, but kindly note our extremely festive gables. I found myself inside the Raleigh Tavern, not by accident, I assure you. The Colonial Tavern was less bar with talking buffalo heads, and more ancient Starbucks that served turkey pies and political unrest. Inside, a fire blazed with the sort of confident crackling only possible when a large log decides to become art. Around it, patriots and pudding enthusiasts alike sat sipping cider laced with mysterious herbs and no small amount of brandy. A fiddler leaned against the wall, playing tunes that gently encouraged your foot to tap without your permission. The melody was an old English carol, one imported across the sea and rebranded ever so slightly, like all good things eventually are in America. I sat by the fire, my cup warm and suspiciously aromatic. A gentleman next to me explained that meat pies were mandatory at Christmas here, as if every pewter plate came with a legal obligation. The pie in question arrived moments later, and it was like biting into a time machine, baked by a grandmother with trust issues. Stewed beef, mincemeat, nutmeg, and whatever else happened to be on the pantry shelves in mid-December. It didn't matter. It steamed victoriously, the rightful champion over every diet resolution yet to be invented. As the hour grew late and the fire wore thin, voices around the room softened, not from fatigue, but from that slow settling satisfaction one feels after a meal shared and a story told. A toast was raised, not to independence or victory or even King George, but simply to good cheer. It hung in the air like a gentle spell. Nothing revolutionary, just warm. Outside, the snow had begun again, just a whisper now. The candles still burned in their windows, patient beacons in this long, lovely dark. My boots found fresh crunch beneath them as I walked on, past drawn curtains golden with firelight, and further ahead, through thinning trees and under a sky stitched with stars, I sensed the scent of wood smoke and something else, perhaps cloves, or perhaps simply destiny wrapped in pine. There was still more of this walk awaiting me, but not in a hurry. For now, the hush of candlelight and the memory of a warm pie would walk with me, step by dream-soaked step. The snow had thickened into the soft sort that falls like it's changing its mind halfway down. In the dim wash of winter twilight, the town green of Williamsburg lay wrapped in a downy white hush, like a sleepy cat curled by a fireplace. The lanterns glowed softly along the path, casting shapes that resembled people and possibly geese in coats, depending on your imaginative flexibility. I made my way toward a modest house with whitewashed siding and a green shutter slightly askew, a small detail that suggested its owner had intended to fix it since last March. But then June arrived, and suddenly it was too hot, and suddenly it was December again. A universal human trait, benign neglect, spanning centuries. Inside I was greeted by the faint scent of apples and cloves, and the sound of someone plunking away at a spinet. The notes weren't particularly in tune, but they were confident. The musician, a young woman in a linen cap and an expression of intense concentration, paused only to glance at a fire crackling confidently behind her. Colonial fireplaces, I've noticed, are nothing if not overachievers. She turned and offered me a polite nod, the kind perfected by those who've spent their lives being pleasant to house guests, middling violinists, and that one cousin who's always just passing through until spring. I made myself comfortable near the hearth and observed the room. A sprig of greenery hung above the door, likely holly or mistletoe, depending on whether the intention was festive charm or forced romantic tension. Beneath it sat a plate of thin biscuits, which I was assured were quite popular for Christmastide, though I suspected their main ingredient was Puritan disappointment. Christmas in Colonial America wasn't the raucous, sticky sweet affair it would later become. No jingling bells, no inflatable reindeer, and certainly no eggnog in cartons, more's the pity. In Virginia, for instance, the day was marked with dignity. Quiet church services, modest feasts, the sort of spirited restraint that only truly flourishes when it's cold and you've already eaten all the apples from last autumn's cellar. I was poured a mug of warm cider, its surface swirling with steam and ambivalence about whether it still counted as a beverage or a dessert. In the colonial household, cider was a staple. Water was a gamble, milk was for children or cows, and tea, well, let's just say politics got steeped right into the pot after a certain Boston incident. So cider it was, fermented, fizzy, and generally more cheerful than half the town. Suddenly, the door swung open, releasing a gust of chilly air and a man with cheeks as red as rebellion. He removed his tricorn hat with a flourish that suggested either deep manners or mild frostbite. "Apologies," he said, shaking off snow in a way that made me understand the true purpose of foyers. The cow required coaxing. The phrase hung in the air as if we should all silently nod, which we did. Colonial cows, I'm told, are not easily persuaded. The conversation turned, as most things did back then, to the size of turkeys, the density of puddings, and the weather's latest display of theatrical drama. Somewhere along the line, someone mentioned the 12 days of Christmas, and not the song with the partridges and unnecessary avian abundance, but the original calendar custom. Back then, Christmas wasn't a one-day affair, but rather a series of holy days and mildly unholy feasts leading up to Twelfth Night, when things traditionally got just a smidge lively, possibly involving wassail and questionable decision-making. There were tales recounted of neighbours who once roasted whole pigs, accompanied by little dramas about who got the best bits, and whether Sally Prentice's seasonal punch included spirits or mere wishful thinking. All told in soft, rambling tones before the hearth, their shadows dancing like old stories come to visit. Outside, it had begun to snow in earnest, fat flakes falling like lazy confetti, as if the sky itself had decided to celebrate at a much slower, sleepier pace. I settled deeper into my chair, the cider warming my hands, the fire lulling the room into a gentle yawn. and as the spinet resumed its gentle plinking, I wondered what the holiday looked like through the wooden shutters of the next house over, where flickering candlelight whispered just as softly through the snow. And so it was, with the late December dusk swaddling the world in a velvet shawl of wintry gloom, that I found myself strolling down the modest high street of a certain colonial village whose name had too many vowels and not enough ambition to make it onto most maps. It was the kind of place where snow didn't merely fall, it politely arrived, one flake at a time, like powdered sugar being sifted over gingerbread rooftops by an invisible and slightly whimsical baker. As I approached the local tavern, the Sober Goose, so named during that brief period when temperance was fashionable even among innkeepers, I was met with the merry clatter of tankards and the warm, yeasty perfume of baked apples and dark wheat ale. I peeked through the slightly fogged window and spotted a gathering of gents in various degrees of wool and wisdom. They were swapping stories, nursing cider, and arguing with academic passion over whether Governor Hutchinson truly did have the largest wig this side of the Atlantic. Inside, the tavern's hearth crackled with gentle confidence, as if it had been trained to keep people warm without demanding applause. On the mantel sat a sprig of holly, its berries bright and festive, if somewhat assertive in their redness. Along the rafters, strings of bayberry tallow candles flickered, not unlike colonial fireflies in captivity, gently melting their wax into the scent of yesteryear. It must be said, colonial Christmases were not quite the festive extravaganzas we might imagine now. In New England especially, the holiday was eyed with suspicion, as though it was something altogether too Catholic, too merry, or too likely to encourage dancing. The Puritans, bless their joyless little hearts, actually banned the holiday in the mid-1600s. They found the revelry excessive, the wassail too enthusiastic, and, heaven forbid, the mince pies vaguely pagan. But by the time I wandered into the Sober Goose, times had become more relaxed, as had waistcoats, and the spirit of Christmas had begun to return to the colonies, though still a bit shyly, like a party guest who arrives an hour early and doesn't know where to put their hands. Jacob, the innkeeper, a man with a tremendous beard and an even more tremendous belief in the medicinal benefits of rum, offered me a mug of warm cheer, half cider, half something no one chose to identify too closely. I took a sip and instantly understood why colonial shoes came with such sturdy heels. "Cold out, is it?" he asked, as if the frost on my eyebrows wasn't already answering for me. "Only dramatically so," I said. "One of those nights where even the moon puts on a scarf." He chuckled and nodded to a nearby group of fiddlers who were attempting a festive carol with varying levels of musical competence and commitment. The violinist appeared to be harmonizing with a chair leg in a quiet corner booth shaped ideally for eavesdropping. 3 matrons were threading cranberries and popcorn with such intensity you'd think they were sewing secrets into the fabric of the universe. The garlands would later be strung around the meeting house, I was told, though only after a thorough theological debate on whether popcorn had the moral fiber to be considered sacred decoration. Each ornament and sweet, each note of music or steaming mug of odd liquid seemed to exist halfway between celebration and apology, as if the colonies were still slowly learning how to be festive without incurring divine reprimand. Yet there was something undeniably comforting about it all. A hearth shared, cider poured, tidings offered not in grand gestures, but in small, brave acts of warmth. As the night wore on, the snow grew bold, flinging itself against the tavern windows like a child demanding entrance. The fiddlers transitioned to a slow, melancholic tune. The Boar's Head Carol, I think, although my memory may be softened by the cider. And the candlelight shimmered in soft agreement. The scent of cloves and pine needles mingled with candle smoke, and I sat back, letting the centuries loosen their grip. Eventually, I thanked Jacob, pulled my coat up to my ears, and stepped once again into the powdered stillness. The village was quiet now, its crooked signs and shuttered shops coated in moon-touched snow. As I wandered past fences hung with drying herbs and doorways trimmed with evergreen boughs, I could feel the weight of the season. Old, a little awkward, but deeply, sleepily sincere. Up ahead, just beyond the old smithy, the faint sound of bells on a sleigh, or perhaps just wind teasing the iron, beckoned me forward. A faint rustle of pine boughs whispered above me as I wandered down a narrow path lined with frost-laced undergrowth. The sun, such as it was during a colonial American December, had taken to merely suggesting light rather than actually providing any. It lingered behind a gauzy curtain of clouds, like a shy child refusing to come downstairs. I drew my borrowed cloak a little tighter and inhaled the scent of wood smoke and damp soil, pressing deeper into a quiet, snow-dusted grove. Tucked between a crooked split-rail fence and a half-frozen creek stood a modest log cabin, a smaller, simpler cousin of the stately plantation homes I'd seen earlier in my dreaming strolls. This was the kind of home where wood creaked in dialects, where shoes dried on the hearth, and where even the cat probably had chores. A gentle knock and a few distinctly colonial creaks later, I stepped inside and was bathed in warmth and smells. Sweet cornbread, iron skillet apples, and unexpectedly, something very close to cardamom. A woman, wrapped in layers of homespun practicality, stirred at the hearth and offered me the kind of welcome that didn't require words. Just a nod, a glance toward the fireside bench, and a piece of warm bread with the faintest shimmer of maple. This was the home of a joiner, a furniture maker skilled enough to build a table that could outlive 3 generations and possibly 2 revolutions. His name was Mr. Elisha Wickham, and he greeted me with a slow smile and hands so calloused they looked like sculpted bark. The scent of sawdust clung to him like a second coat, and when he spoke, it was the soothing drawl of someone who measured time in seasons rather than seconds. He invited me out back to his workshop, a lean-to more ambitious than sturdy, filled with chisels, cleverly fashioned jigs, and half-finished chairs that, even in their skeletal forms, looked like they were waiting for Daniel Webster to come have a seat and hold forth for 3 hours on federalism. Mr. Wickham, it turned out, had been preparing for one of the cornerstones of the colonial Yuletide season, the building of the Christmas bench. This was no ordinary bench. No, this was the bench that was dragged into the center of the common room on Christmas Eve, freshened with a sprig of pine or boxwood, and placed directly in front of the fire. There, younger cousins, elderly aunts, and the occasional itinerant goose-shooer would pile onto it for hours, swapping stories, slipping into naps, and generally achieving the kind of cozy inertia that only a blazing hearth can create. I admired the carvings along the back rail, stars, pine cones, a cluster of grapes, and curiously, what looked like a rather judgmental-looking turkey. Mr. Wickham chuckled when I asked. "Carved that after last Michaelmas," he said. "Bird had ambition but no sense. Took a swing at the dog, then got into the cider mash. Found it asleep in a boot. Never forget that turkey." He chuckled to himself and returned to his planing, curls of wood cascading to the shop floor like frozen ribbons. As he worked, he told me of the traditions drifting into the colonies with every sailing ship. The English Yule log, which here was more often a sturdy pine than a noble oak. The German Advent calendars, rare in these parts but occasionally smuggled into Moravian settlements. And the curious Dutch habit of hanging stockings, which some New Yorkers, formerly New Amsterdammers, were beginning to adopt, provided they remembered which child resembled which foot. We paused at the sound of bells, small ones, tinkling from the direction of the house. His daughter, a girl of about 10, with a wild cloud of cricket curls and 2 front teeth missing in opposite corners, had tied bits of tin and wire to the cat. It jingled with great resentment, stalking beneath the table like a furry harbinger of Christmas mischief. "Winter boredom," Mr. Wickham sighed, not unkindly. "She'll be weaving pine dolls next, and by 12th night, probably staging full morality plays with bread crusts." The fire crackled again, and for a moment the world outside seemed to shrink to just this cabin, this room, and the warmth of people who knew how to carve out joy from cold days and long nights. The simplicity of it all, the bench, the bread, the stories passed from chisel to child, quieted something inside me, like a snowflake landing gently on a still pond. I thanked the Wickhams and stepped back outside, the sky now a soft shade of pewter, as shadows began to stretch like cats across the sleeping ground. I tightened the sash of my cloak and turned eastward, toward the sound of music floating faintly on the wind, pressed dulcimers, a fiddle, and laughter. It seemed a Christmas gathering was already underway. Somewhere between the frost of twilight and the molasses-thick darkness of a colonial December evening, I found myself a guest at one of the most quietly electric gatherings in all of Williamsburg. Not a military muster, nor a town hall debate over the price of salt pork. No, those were far too loud and utterly unsuitable for our sleepy escapade. This, dear listener, was something far more intimate and vaguely citrus-scented. A colonial tea party, but not the rebellious kind, mind you. No chests of tea hurled into harbours here. This was the genteel, wintry sort, tucked indoors, steaming mugs warming mittened hands, perfumed with lemon peel and clove, and presided over by women so elegant they made a snowbank seem overdressed. I slipped, quite literally, over the slick threshold of the Widow Cartwright's parlour, catching myself only on a side table that was precariously balancing both a candle holder and a plate of delicate, lard soft gingerbread. Naturally, I chose gingerbread over Grace and rescued it first. The candle took a nosedive. The widow mercifully laughed. "Best arrival since the governor's carriage lost a wheel," she smiled, eyes twinkling. "Come in, warm yourself, and try not to set fire to anything else." The room was thick with the scent of pine garland, citrus rind, beeswax, and stern opinions. It was fashionable at the time for hostesses to host small tea gatherings, for talk of virtue, fashion, and letters, which, translated loosely, meant gentle gossip about whose turkey weighed most, which daughter had the finer embroidery stitches, and whether Mrs. Hickory's punch bowl was truly cut glass or just wishful thinking. A spinning wheel rested by the fire like a sleepy old cat, unused tonight in honour of merrier pursuits. Between the clinking of silver spoons and the creak of high-backed chairs, a chorus of modest laughter rose and fell like snow off a roof. I nestled near the hearth, my borrowed woolen stockings doing their best impression of mittens for my feet, and I sank into the rhythms of the room. Now, if you've never heard colonial women engage in festive critique, it's something between a lullaby and a rap battle. Mrs. Elmira Plum, a lady draped in more ruffles than actual fabric delivered a silence-piercing declaration. Of course, no proper Christmas table is complete without a marchpane peacock. My cousin in Philadelphia boasts hers took 3 weeks to mould. 3 weeks, the widow Cartwright said, levelling her teacup like a dueling pistol. It should take precisely the length of Handel's Messiah, and not a note longer. Another woman shrugged knowingly, dunking something jammy into her tea. For my part, she said, I find any bird made of sugar puts real goose to shame for conversation, if not for substance. There, you see. Centuries ahead of our own holiday potluck debates, these spirited women laid down the measuring spoons of judgment, not with cruelty, but with a well-sugared wit and an apron stitched full of opinions. As the tea cooled and the embers settled into that particular glow of late evening thoughts, the conversation took a turn toward holiday traditions. One woman, her hair powdered to an exacting, chalky optimism, recounted her family's practice of hanging apples on the tree. Oranges, of course, were for those of higher means, or those with relatives in Barbados, which was said with just enough envy to warm the teapot anew. The Christmas tree itself was still more legend than living room centerpiece, especially in the coastal colonies, where German influence hadn't yet sent fir trees gallivanting indoors. Instead, homes were often adorned with swags of greenery, dried fruits, and the occasional gilded walnut. One ambitious neighbor hid a baked pea inside a pie, declaring whosoever found it would be crowned Lord of Misrule for the evening. Some cheered, others chewed carefully. The hour grew long, the fire sighed, and with a yawn that could only belong to a well-fed and well-rested tabby, the widow Cartwright's cat meandered in and took his throne upon a cushion fashioned entirely of retired petticoats. I bade the ladies a yawning good night, tucking a gingerbread friend into my coat pocket for the road. Historical accuracy requires souvenirs, after all, and stepped outside into the crisp hush of moonlit Virginia. Snow had begun its gentle descent, like feathers from a pillow fight between angels, and the night seemed enchanted by laughter still echoing behind drawn curtains. The air smelled of pine and possibility. Lamps flickered in the windows, golden halos in the dark. And just ahead, over the frosty hill, I heard music. Soft strings plucked in celebration. A colonial fiddle dance was surely underway. The snow had just started whispering down again. Those soft, dithering flakes that fall slowly, like they're either deeply thoughtful or indecisive. I tucked my scarf more tightly under my chin and followed a winding path lined with smoke-scented air toward a modest house near the edge of the village. It smelled faintly of chestnuts, pine resin, and the enigmatic musk of wool mittens dried too many times by the hearth. I had been told this was the home of the village cooper, Mr. Humphrey Tibbets, a man who made barrels by day, and, if rumour held true, absolutely infallible figgy pudding by night. As I knocked gently on the door, a dog barked once inside in the sort of tone that said, "I'm contractually obligated to do this," and the door creaked open to reveal a man with a face carved sternly by the elements, but eyes that twinkled like someone who had once accidentally invented eggnog. "Ah, visitor," he said, with a nod that was mostly moustache. I stepped in, and instantly the warmth wrapped around me like an overzealous aunt. The fire crackled in the corner, and a row of suspended shallots and drying herbs hung overhead, like a surprisingly aromatic chandelier. I turned to hang up my coat and found myself nose to nose with a barrel so well made it deserved an award, or at least a flattering poem. Humphrey saw me admiring his handiwork. Oak staves, iron hoops, no nails, he said proudly, patting the barrel like it might be his son, watertight enough to hold the tears of an anxious clergyman. I nodded with all the solemn respect I could muster. Cooperage, the making of barrels, was an unsung art of colonial life. You see, before Tupperware was a twinkle in anyone's plastic-loving eye, barrels were the universal storage solution. Dry goods, salted meats, pickled eggs, gunpowder, molasses, and in rare, tragic miscalculations, all of them at once. Coopers like Mr. Tibbets were indispensable artisans in every community. A good cooper could build 30 barrels in a week, or possibly 25 plus a stool if he was feeling mischievous. Apprentices trained for years, learning to balance the precise angles and curves required. Every stave, the vertical slabs of wood that made the barrel's body, had to be shaved to just the right bevel. If done wrong, your barrel leaked. If done right, it could travel the seas and keep rum happier than most sailors. "Would you care for some plum broth?" asked Humphrey suddenly, lifting a pan from the hearth. Now, I'll admit, the phrase plum broth sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the snow outside, but I remembered I was a guest, and in colonial America, declining offered food was only slightly less insulting than stealing someone's pig. So I accepted, and to my pleasant surprise, plum broth was sweeter, warmer, and substantially less brothy than I feared. It was more like a warm fruit punch that had read one too many sermons and had grown up papery and respectable. Humphrey sat across from me, sipping his own steaming mug, and we fell into a silence shared only by men who both appreciated a good lathe and the gentle vapour of stewed prunes. Outside the window, I could just make out a woman shaking a rug in the wind, the slow rhythm visible even in lamplight. Thump, 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 the colonial percussion of chores. "Barrels," Humphrey began suddenly, as if no time had lapsed at all, "are like people, too tall or too wide and they leak, but you shape 'em right. They'll carry more than they seem." I considered this. It was either a profound metaphor about human potential, or he was still thinking about plum broth. Eventually I rose, thanking him with the kind of gratitude one saves for those rare souls who feed both the body and the historical curiosity. He insisted I take a small bundle of dried apples with me, for the road, he said, with a wink that implied the road might contain some apple-related emergencies. Out in the snow again, the stars overhead looked like flowers scattered across a slate countertop. My boots crunched the icy path as I walked back into the sleeping folds of the village, barrels and broth still warm in my mind. Ahead, I saw the low flicker of lanterns hanging from the eaves of the joiner's workshop. The low hum of wood being planed drifted toward me through the snowy hush, sturdy and rhythmic. It seemed the night wasn't quite through with its quiet wonders just yet. We had just turned down a wooded path flanked by quiet pines, soft snow collecting in the hollowed webs of bare branches. The trees stood like polite spectators, watching the slow progress of my boots in the snow, their needles catching flakes as if they were hoarding sugar. With each crunch beneath my feet, colonial America inched forward into a quieter sort of winter twilight. It was in this sleepy shimmer of snow and silence that I stumbled upon an unlikely gathering. A group of colonial children huddled around something in the snow. I approached cautiously, as one would any wild colony of small humans, known for their unpredictable bursts of song and stick-based jousting. But this particular crowd was affably engaged in the construction of what appeared to be a snow church. Not a snowman, no top hats or carrot noses here, but a lumpy white chapel complete with a steeple made from bundled corn stalks and a tiny pinecone bell. "You shall not pass," one cherub-faced boy declared from the doorway, brandishing a twig like a ceremonial scepter. "This is the Lord's house, and also," he paused, lowering his voice dramatically, "where we keep the good pies till supper." Respecting the sanctity of the snowy structure and, more urgently, the sanctity of any place storing pies, I bowed solemnly at their threshold and moved along. As the path slipped southward towards the edge of the town's modest square, I caught sight of a peculiar figure seated near the root cellar of a weather-aged cottage. He was wrapped in a cloak that looked unmistakably like someone had chopped up 3 tablecloths and stitched them into something resembling fashion. This was, I soon learned, Obadiah Spindle, a tinkerer, musician, and the unofficial inventor of the colonial kazoo. You see, Obadiah had long ago determined that upon reaching adulthood, his civic duty was to muddle through life making noises where silence dared settle. It was he who had once stood at a town meeting and proposed that all official letters include a doodle in the margins for levity and emotional nuance. He was, naturally, overruled. Tonight, he was tooting triumphantly into what looked like a gourd attached to a goose feather. "A Yuletide ode," he explained, between impressive honks, "to the blessed chicken who hatched her eggs too early and brought warmth to our kitchen hearth last winter." I assured him the feathered muse would be immortalized forever in kazoo folklore, and left him to continue his squawking solo. As it happens, his audience consisted exclusively of geese, who appeared confused, impressed, and possibly offended. Moving toward town, it became clear that the colonists, for all their primness and Puritan pride, held nothing back when it came to ornamenting their homes come Christmastide. Doors were garnished with dried apple rings, strung carefully beside sharp-smelling sprigs of cedar. Windows glowed with dipped tallow candles, their small flames flickering like hesitant blushes on the cold cheeks of leaded glass. And then, just around the corner from the blacksmith's, I stumbled upon the oddest little Christmas market I'd ever seen, lit by lanterns, warmed by cider steam, and filled with enough hand-whittled toys to supply an army of squirrels with wooden muskets and horses on wheels. I met a merchant there who boasted of having invented the rotating pudding candle. This was essentially a dish of plum pudding placed over a hollowed-out candle base which, if warmed too rapidly, would erupt into what he called a seasonal display of flame and feeling. Patrons were advised to stand back. Nearby, a woman in an apron the color of morning frost was selling rum-cured figs for virtuous sinners, winking at me like she knew something about the afterlife and had no intention of keeping it to herself. They say Christmas in colonial times was quiet, subdued, perhaps even discouraged, particularly by the Puritans who felt Yuletide frolicking was suspiciously European. But clearly, moderation had lost its battle sometime after sundown. The market whirled around me in slow motion, ribbons fluttering from baskets, children tugging at skirts, pipes exhaling sweet plainsong into the stars above. I sat for a long moment by the fire pit at the market centre, sipping cider from a pewter mug that may once have doubled as a chamber pot, though I chose not to follow that line of inquiry. I watched the snow fall in lazy drifts and listened to small things, laughter in clusters, boots tapping wooden planks, the distant trill of Obadiah's goose hymn, until I felt the hum of sleep stretch across my shoulders like an old woolen shawl. And just then, drawn in by the scent of molasses and memory, I noticed a curious figure crossing the far end of the square, carrying something round, wrapped in cloth. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and followed quietly, the lantern light flickering, guiding me toward the next confection of colonial surprise. As moonlight spilled across the snow-covered roofs of colonial Trenton, I turned my wool-wrapped self down a narrow lane fragrant with pipe smoke and cinnamon. The scent drifted like a ghost from the brick oven of the town's only bakery, nudging the air with promises of molasses bread and ginger snaps shaped like jolly Puritans. It was late, well, late in colonial terms, which meant anything after 8 p.m, when the tavern's candles were dimming and even your neighbor's goats had insisted on turning in. The world was still, save the gentle creak of icicles growing fat along the eaves and the polite rustling of a squirrel who had absolutely no business being this awake. I found myself passing a humble but unusually festive cottage, blinking in the glow of real beeswax candles strung precariously in its front windows. Through the slats, I glimpsed a small family, mother, father, 2 children, and what appeared to be a wigless grandfather, gathered around a bowl of punch, the fire casting orange-yellow halos over their homespun caps and ruddy cheeks. Ah yes, the traditional holiday punch. A curious blend of rum, cider, and whatever the good Lord provided, which on this chilly night apparently included grated nutmeg and at least 2 floating raisins clinging to life. Despite the cold, I paused outside their window a few moments. Not to eavesdrop, of course, but to appreciate the charming ritual of wassailing, a colonial practice that could mean anything from caroling to politely asking your neighbors for booze in exchange for a song. In the spirit of anthropological accuracy, I hummed a deeply respectful baritone rendition of the Boar's Head Carol under my scarf. No one heard me. The squirrel, again, seemed unimpressed. Continuing along, I was wrapped in the muffled calm of a colonial winter night, the kind of cold that made your breath look like an apology to the sky. I ambled past the meeting house, where someone had left a carved wooden snow goose in place of a proper wreath. The goose wore a ribbon. I neither questioned it nor judged it. Artistic expression was thriving in the colonies, even if it largely involved avian lawn ornaments or quilting slogans about Providence. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of fiddles. Not one, mind you, multiple fiddles, playing what I could only describe as a vigorously festive jig. Drawn by curiosity and the vague hope of ginger cordial, I followed the music to a large barn lantern lit from within. Peering inside the open door, I beheld what might best be described as a colonial rave, minus electricity, glow sticks, or angst. Men and women, young and old, twirled in meticulous patterns across the hay-dusted floor. Their leather shoes tapped in time to reel after reel, and their laughter rose in warm clouds through the rafters. There was no formal invitation needed at events like these. If you had 2 sturdy legs and a decent resistance to fiddle fatigue, you were welcomed. A kindly older woman with a mob cap wider than her own shoulders handed me a tankard of spiced ale and ushered me into the merriment. I bowed, the way I imagined a person bows when asked to join a contra dance they've never practiced. And within moments, I was weaving patterns with strangers, smiling like an imprecise but enthusiastic maypole. It's worth noting that, yes, colonial dancing was less Jane Austen gliding and more strategic scooting between people wearing many layers of wool. But what it lacked in elegance, it more than made up for in community. No one minded if you missed a step or spun the wrong way. In fact, error seemed part of the charm. We were simply together, stamping the frost out of our boots in rhythm with the music and the turning world. At the end of one lively set, An elderly man with cheeks the hue of fermented crabapple clapped me on the back and said, "Good footwork, young sir. You dance like a man who's outrun a tax collector." Now that, I told him, was the nicest thing anyone had ever said to me. As the night slowed and couples returned to their benches to cool off and share slices of dried apple and hearty wedges of cheddar cheese, I slipped quietly back into the evening hush, my breath still visible, my heart a little warmer. The stars above flickered with approval, or possibly indigestion. It was hard to say. And as I wandered along the quiet road once more, with the sound of laughter behind me, I found myself heading toward the next delight tucked in history's frosted pocket. The snow had softened to a fine, whispering flurry, like someone dusting powdered sugar across the rooftops of Williamsburg with a sleepy hand. By now, the sky had dimmed into a brushed slate grey, an old pewter plate flipped upside down, and the lanterns flickering along Duke of Gloucester Street filled the town with a golden hush. I followed my nose to a warm scent curling through the air like a well-tied bow. The unmistakable aroma of gingerbread, molasses heavy, sticky, dense, and proudly colonial. Inside a modest little bakery, barely as wide as an ox cart, I met a woman whose apron had seen more butter than a Virginia dairy cow, and whose expression suggested she took spicy baked goods very seriously. "This here's Eliza's Christmas gingerbread," she said, patting a tray that steamed with authority. "Been baking since fourth night." Fourth night, I soon realized, was not a Renaissance-themed disco party, but simply the fourth evening after Christmas. Colonial folks did enjoy a full 12 days of Christmas after all, with fewer lords a-leaping and more days of pudding-related digestion. Eliza insisted I try a piece, and I did. Warm, spiced and so dense, I briefly considered preserving it for posterity under glass. "This'll survive the winter," she said proudly, "and half the British Navy." She wasn't wrong. The British Navy might even surrender willingly, lured in by the scent and sheer gravitational pull of her desserts. Outside, I wandered over to the town green, where a small group of children were making snow angels, or perhaps just approximations of snow ducks, depending on how charitable one felt. They dashed about in wool cloaks 2 sizes too large, their mitts flapping like the wings of distracted pigeons. One boy stopped to inform me, with great solemnity, that General Washington's favorite Christmas gift was socks. "Proper woolen ones," he added. "Not those ones with the lacy bits. Men of substance wear socks like battlegrounds." I couldn't argue. Washington, it is said, was particularly fond of sturdy hosiery and even specified sock styles in his correspondence. If ever a man could march through snow with dignity, it was he, and with stylish feet, no less. By now, the tavern keepers were lighting extra candles, filling the window panes with golden halos. I stepped into one such establishment, where a group of musicians were tuning their viols, fiddles, and a peculiar instrument that looked suspiciously like a milk churn with strings. "Welcome," chirped the innkeeper. "You're just in time for the wassail." Ah yes, the wassail, a festive drink and event rolled into one, where colonists would gather to toast orchards, neighbours, and wandering souls with a steaming bowl of spiced cider strong enough to reroute riverboats. One gentleman, dressed like a tapestry had swallowed a goose, raised his cup and sang a line so meandering, even the fireplace seemed confused. Wassailing, it turns out, wasn't merely about delicious drinks, but also about giving your houseplants the pep talk they didn't know they needed. The cider was thick, sweet, and redolent of cinnamon, cloves, and slightly singed optimism. Each cup came with the implied suggestion, Don't make any sudden movements afterwards. A colonial hangover, I imagined, felt like being kicked by a musket. Nearby, two women discussed the curious news that oranges had arrived from the Caribbean via Charleston. I gave mine to the cat, one said solemnly. He's never had such enlightenment. Colonial cats, of course, were unaccustomed to citrus, which usually played a distant second fiddle to mice and philosophical brooding. Outside again, the night was drawing close. The snow had thickened into lazy spirals, and the town felt wrapped in wool, thick, scratchy, homespun. A man with a cart passed me, shouting, "Sugar plums! Get your sugar plums!" I did not, in fact, get a sugar plum, possibly because no one, not even the vendor, seemed entirely sure what it was. Confectionery, yes, but how sugary, how plum-like? That remained a mystery. Some things in colonial America were best left ambiguous, like the postal service or your neighbor's barrel labeled pickles and miscellaneous. I ambled back past the candlelit windows, watching silhouettes dancing slow jigs or dozing by hearths, bellies full of roast goose and theoretical sugar plums. The streets were calm now, quieter than an unopened letter from Parliament. My breath rose like faint tobacco smoke in the cold, drifting upward into the night's waiting velvet. Somewhere in the distance, a fiddle began playing Greensleeves, though the fiddler paused halfway through, evidently forgetting the middle part. The melody stopped, then picked back up as God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, which tells you everything you need to know about colonial improvisation and the flexibility of folk tunes. I turned toward the thickening snowpath, boots crunching through the soft hush of evening, curiosity leading me onward, past fences draped in pine boughs, and onward toward a house, half-lit, mysterious, and said to host the most curious celebration of the season. By the time I wandered past the final frost-bitten fence post of the Virginia countryside, dusk had started buttering the tops of the pine trees in gold. The air had the resigned stillness of a winter evening, that knowing hush that settles in when everyone agrees. Yes, we've done enough for one day. Even the chickens had stopped judging me from their coops. A rare moment of holiday mercy. Ahead stood the gentle glow of a modest manor, warm candlelight flickering from diamond-leaded windows, shadows dancing like gossipy ghosts across the panes. This was not the home of a wealthy tobacco lord, nor a bustling tavern brimming with shouting men and questionable pies. No, it was something softer, slower, a homestead deep in December's pocket. As I approached, mingled scents of wood smoke and stewing apples teased their way down the chimney and out across the snow. A hound raised its head from the stoop, but, true to the mood of the evening, made no effort beyond a sigh. We were both too tired for formalities. Inside, a family had gathered near the hearth, 3 generations folded into one another like layers of a warm quilt. Grandfather sat closest to the fire, puffing a pipe carved neatly with initials too worn to decipher. His chair creaked in a rhythm older than the United States itself. They welcomed me without much fuss. In colonial America, strangers didn't arrive with threats. They arrived with gossip and extra hands for peeling root vegetables. I was handed a warm cup of wassail, likely the only safe beverage in the house. Water, in those days, was less a thirst quencher and more a dare. The youngest child, a girl with braids the color of toasted rye, offered me a slice of dessert made from something they called crust with ambition. Bless them, this attempt at a pie had likely been imagined during a season of fruitlessness and general culinary optimism. It tasted slightly of nutmeg, hope, and dust. Conversation drifted easily from snowfall measurements to which neighbours had eloped lately. Apparently, the Wickersham boy had absconded with the cooper's daughter, taking naught but a handcart, a Bible, and 2 jars of pickles as dowry. They'd tried to pass it off as a highly spiritual journey, but even Reverend Haywood knew better. Eloping for religious reasons was out of style by then. Most people just wanted to avoid Aunt Margaret's opinions on trousseaux. As the fire sputtered its smoky lullabies, the family began preparing for the morrow's Christmas celebration. Let's be clear, colonial Christmases were less about gifts and more about surviving frostbite with all your fingers intact. Decorations were simple: evergreens, dried berries, and the occasional citrus fruit if someone had bribed a ship captain recently. Trees weren't brought inside just yet. That particular Germanic import hadn't charmed its way across the Atlantic. Instead, garlands hung from mantles, sprigs of holly tucked behind candles, or onto musket mounts. Nothing says festive quite like a laurel-draped firearm. The youngest son, a boy named Phineas, naturally, was tasked with grating nutmeg into a cloudy punch bowl, using a tool that looked suspiciously like a medieval weapon. He glanced up at me between strokes and whispered, "Pa says if I spill it again, I'll have to churn the butter for all of January." Motivation. Thy name is Churn. Grandmother hummed a tune as she stirred something unidentifiable in a pot. I asked what the song was. She said it was just a melody her own mother used to sing while darning socks. Darning kept the family warm, she noted, but tunes kept the soul from freezing. I nodded, sipping my second helping of wassail, and made a mental note to embroider that onto something, should I ever become suspiciously crafty. Near midnight, they invited me to step outside. The stars were gossamer sharp, piercing the velvet sky like well-aimed hatpins. In the distance, tiny flickers from other hearths blinked through the trees, each one holding its own version of warmth, of story, of surviving December with homemade mittens and inherited gratitude. "We'll go to church at dawn," someone whispered beside me. "Mostly for the music, and to make sure Martha Pickering doesn't hog the good pew cushions again." I chuckled softly. Even back then, finding peace meant dodging overly ambitious neighbours and finding the warmest seat in the house. The family bid me good night in quiet sequence, leaving me standing under a pine branch laced with frost, the air glittering with tomorrow. And so I wandered once more, through the sleepy hush of snow and memory, guided by lantern light and the scent of pine, toward one final tale before the night settled fully in. The snow fell soft as a sigh, blanketing the narrow colonial street like a downy quilt stitched by the hands of December herself. Lanterns flickered in buttery yellows along the cozy lane, casting sleepy shadows across the packed earth where hoofprints and boot heels stitched paths toward hearths and homes. The scent of pine smoke curled lazily into the air, mingling with the subtle tang of cider, cloves, and wishes mumbled into mittens. I strolled slowly, careful not to wake the snow. The colonial village around me, tucked into the folds of late 18th century America, was dressed in its simple finery. A wreath here, a ribbon there. Modesty ruled the day, even during Yuletide. No glitter, no 12-foot-tall inflatable nutcrackers, just honest, garlands of boxwood and a few delightful surprises, like the faint sound of fiddling drifting from the tavern, where several of the town's more spirited souls had decided to defy both weather and common sense for one more night of wassailing. A dim candle glowed in nearly every window, a tradition borrowed partly from Irish settlers and partly from the general colonial belief that light, Even the faintest flicker was an act of hospitality. That glow said, "We may have no electricity, but we do have good intentions, stew on the hearth, and possibly homemade cider if you don't mind it warm and mildly suspicious." Colonial Christmastide was not the fever dream of modern merriment we're used to. No frantic shopping, no blinking reindeer earrings. In fact, in certain corners of early America, particularly good old Puritan New England, Christmas celebrations were seen as suspect at best and papist at worst. For years, Christmas was banned in parts of Massachusetts, which may explain why their descendants are so intense about holiday scheduling. But Virginia, where my feet now padded through quiet powder, had a warmer temperament, both in weather and holiday cheer. Here, plantation homes might host a modest gathering. Mummers might wander the roads in homemade costumes, asking for food in exchange for a performance whose quality ranged from surprisingly delightful to "we owe the cows an apology." And in taverns like the glowing one just ahead, songs would spill over pewter mugs, and the odd game of draughts might turn merry, or slightly aggressive, depending on how long the rum punch had been stewing. I wandered past a small home where a child's stocking, knitted wool, not the modern satin showpieces, hung at a humble fireplace. Stockings in colonial days might receive a penny, a piece of fruit, or if things were particularly wild, a gingerbread figurine shaped like a goat or possibly, and alarmingly, a friend's face. A church bell chimed once, soft and deep. Midnight was near. The town hushed even more, the way brass instruments go quiet just before the conductor lifts the baton. But this conductor was the moon, and her cue was silence and frost. Colonial America didn't exactly invent Christmas traditions. It borrowed them, trimmed them, and sometimes forgot where they came from entirely. Take the Yule log. Imported from Europe, the idea was to burn a massive chunk of wood through the 12 days of Christmas. But in the colonies, fuel was precious, so the log got significantly smaller. In fact, some households simply set a regular log in front of the fire and told it encouraging things. It's the thought that counts. I paused near a stile, watching as one last group of revelers, bundled tight, cheeks flushed with cheer and cider, ambled their way home, laughter puffing like warm ghosts into the chill. One sang what sounded like "God rest ye merry gentlemen," though the tune wandered suspiciously close to Yankee Doodle. It was endearing. Beyond them, the stars dusted the sky in quiet approval, and the scent of snowplum and aging bark stitched itself through the night air. Somewhere nearby, an old hound shifted on a porch and let out a sigh that could have meant anything from good night to leave me out of your quaint historical narrative. So I turned one last time to look down the lane, where colonial Christmas glowed not brightly, but truly, warm and earthy and enough. In this world of musket drills and molasses, of cider-steeped songs and handmade cheer, winter had woven a gentler kind of magic, a reminder that even in a time without bulbs, batteries, or backup singers, joy could still creak open the door and slip in beside the fire. The snow thickened its hush, the flickering windows dimmed behind drawn shutters, and as my boots found their final crunch in the snow, the past pulled its quilt up to its chin and dozed off beside me. Sleep now. We'll leave the lantern burning.